Amazingly, the universe began in chaos. Things were fast. It was cool. Over the years, that chaos would take many forms. But one thing it's never become is portable. Introducing new Sonic Chaos for Game Gear. Chaos with rocket shoes. Chaos with pogo springs. Chaos with Sonic or Tails. Chaos improved. New Sonic Chaos only on Sega Game Gear.
Hey there, Pressure Pals. Welcome to yet another episode of the Pressure Past. This is our second episode, and once again, we're going to be talking about Sega, as January is Sega month. On today's episode, we're going to be discussing the history of handheld games, including the Game Gear, its rise to prominence, and its eventual decline and failure. With me this week, Steve Cuff.
Hey, great to be back.
Hey, Steve. So, the Game Gear, pretty strange if you only were to start with, and then Sega made the Game Gear. But we're not going to do that, because that's not how we do this show. We like to take it way, way back. Let's do that right now. By the late 1970s, video games had achieved mainstream success. Games such as Pong and Space Invaders had everyone from small children to businessmen pumping billions of quarters and 100-yen coins into arcades across America and Japan. At home, the Atari Video Game Computer System, or 2600, became the first successful video game console, selling 750,000 units by 1978. It seemed that video games were everywhere, except on the go. In 1977, Mark Lesser and George Close created Auto Race for Mattel Electronics. The handheld was based off electronic calculators and only used 512 bytes of memory, less than a kilobyte, and a simple LED screen that produced a small amount of red dots. Players could move their dot up, down, left, and right across 3 lanes, avoiding incoming dots. The $25 toy sold out almost immediately. Mattel capitalized on their success with a series of sports games, including Mattel Electronic Football and Mattel Electronic Baseball.
Football 2 from Mattel Electronics.
I said, who's in there?
Hey, Mattel, I know who's in there. You wish, Franco. Look at Football 2's quarterback. Ever seen a better scrambler? A better passer? That's a Bradshaw in there.
Looks like a Bradshaw getting sacked to me.
And intercepted.
I guess that's why they painted it Mean Joe Green.
Football 2 plays so great you think is in there from Mattel Electronics.
Before long, Parker Brothers and Coleco also produced successful handheld games.
With a lot of the early handheld games, they're actually much closer to how video games were with, like, the Odyssey, where they weren't really video games, per se.
Yeah.
They were just, I mean, they were what they were. They were electronic games. So when you think about how the Odyssey worked, it was just manipulating the TV's electronics.
Yeah, you have a square moving around, another square. These were dots.
Yeah,
you know?
So what you're dealing with is just modified electronics that were user-controlled. So there was no real video display.
Not at all. Like it's literally almost like you're playing with Christmas lights. Like one goes on and one goes off, and that implies movement. Like there are just a series of dots that can be filled by this particular light, and that light is either a car, or it's a football player, or a basketball player, or a baseball player. I mean, it's you really have to use your imagination. It's insane.
Yeah, there's very little in the way of visual cues. So the games are interesting in and of themselves just because of kind of the leaps of logic you had to take to say, oh, this is football, this is baseball.
Which it most certainly wasn't. I mean, It's mostly just like lines over the screen to imply what's going on. And even like the sounds were actually just like independent devices in the unit. Like the electronics themselves could not produce sounds. Like this was a separate toy of sorts that was put in there. And I mean, you see a lot of these on eBay nowadays, and they do go for some money. There's not a huge collector's market for these because they were never very fun to play, but they were really different at that time. And I don't think they really felt like video games at all. They really are toys. These are definitely toys.
Yeah, they're cool to play just from a conceptual standpoint. Like, it's fun to hold it in your hand and kind of see what it's like and how it compared to other games at the time then and games now. So it's an interesting timepiece, but yeah, it's not the most exciting thing in the world.
And there is no template for these per se. Like with Auto Race, you had like 2 gears that you shifted up and down, and then there would be totally different controls for the football game. None of these were like the same thing as like a console, which would have like one singular form factor where cartridges would go in. This was just an independent game that was in plastic and sold for $25, and they were huge. Kids loved them, and so did adults. It's hard to believe that this ever existed if you own a phone and you can just download any game you want and use this amazing touchscreen device. This was literally just a black screen and blinking lights and paint on top of it. Over in Japan, a 38-year-old toy designer and engineer named Gunpei Yokoi observed a businessman aimlessly tapping away at a calculator in an effort to pass the time on a long train ride. Yokoi envisioned that a repurposed calculator could play small games and tell time. He took the idea to his employer, Nintendo. In 1980, Nintendo released the first Game & Watch, simply titled Ball.
Game Watch, Game Watch, Game Watch, Game Watch. It's a demo Game Watch, no demo Game Watch, tell a demo Game Watch, Game Watch. ジャッジ、ボール、バーミン、ファイヤー、マイクロコンピューターを使ったゲームウォッチ。ゲームをしないときはデジタル式クォーツ時計です。ゲームウォッチ。
The game was simple. A man attempted to juggle a series of balls that could land in one of 3 areas on the left and right of the screen. Game & Watch Ball was a huge success and would lead to nearly 60 more Game & Watches, each with their own unique design, including the first instance of a D-pad with Game & Watch Donkey Kong, eventually even being released in America.
Adventure is on the horizon. Stanley's going buggy. Mario Brothers have their hands full, and Donkey Kong's going ape. It's rough seas for Popeye, and Snoopy's got to get on the ball. But you can help. You got Nintendo Game & Watch. That's pocket power. Widescreen or multi-screen games you can play indoors or out. They tell you the score and even the time. They're pocket power. They're Game & Watch. 14 in all, only from Nintendo.
The Game & Watch was a huge step forward. You know, this was very, very early on in the 1980s. They sort of set a template that companies would follow for literally over a decade.
Yeah.
Even more so than that. If you look at all the Tiger Electronic handheld games,
Totally.
those are essentially Game & Watches.
Yeah.
They're standalone, single games, simple gameplay, usually no more than, 2, 3, 4 buttons max. With a simple goal, simple objectives.
Yeah, and it's really not too different in some ways to the Mattel Electronics we were talking about with like dots filling in other dots. Here there was already like black LEDs, where you could have like, oh, his arm is going to move here or there to like juggle the ball, or Donkey Kong where he can only move here or there. I'm sure if you ever had a Tiger Electronic, if you like exposed it to a light and angled it just right, you could see where all the quote-unquote animations would be, because you never really moved anywhere. There was no free movement. You were selecting one of 3 options at any given time. Because of that, once again, they were all different. They would have completely different controls. That's where the D-pad very first started off. And, Game & Watches are actually pretty rare. They're worth a lot of money. And a few of the ideas from Game & Watch would go on for Nintendo, 25, 30 years down the line. The DS is basically a version of one of the latter Game & Watches, the clamshell design. And, of course, the D-pad. It's really fascinating to see how Gunpei Yokoi had transitioned from making toys, like the extended arm grabber, to actual games, like electronic games. Like, he was really helping Nintendo evolve into games more and more heavily. Whereas previously they'd, dipped a toe here or there in arcades before later on releasing Radar Scope. That's a different story.
It's also interesting to see how the Game & Watch went from being something that was literally used to tell time, but you could also kind of, waste time on the bus playing a little game, to something that was more game-focused. So by the time you get to something like Donkey Kong or some of the rarer Game & Watches, which actually look like little mini arcade units, like there's a Snoopy one.
Oh, yeah.
They don't look like a watch or, something super portable at all.
Not at all. And, I think actually mentioning that there is a watch there maybe will help explain, maybe to younger listeners, how it works. If you have, like, a traditional alarm clock, there are these 4 circles, and they will produce those numbers, but those numbers can only be produced in those 4 circles. Now, when you're looking at something on your phone, there's actual art that has been designed. Here is the number 9, and it's different from the number 7. But if you look at a classic alarm clock, that's basically how the game plays. It fills in already pre-selected shapes. It's rather barbaric. While portable games were popular, they were limited compared to their console counterparts. Jay Smith, an engineer at Mattel Electronics, left Mattel to start his own company, Smith Engineering. Rather than creating a handheld game, Smith designed a portable console, the first of its kind, that would allow players to swap out cartridges and play different games. Each cartridge would be inserted in the front, essentially becoming the cover of the Microvision, and include its own controls. There were a few features that would remain constant. The Microvision included a panel below the cartridge and featured a 16 by 16 LCD screen. The Microvision contained 72 bits of RAM with a processor speed of 100 kilohertz. In 1979, Milton Bradley released the Microvision to the American and European market with the pack-in game Blockbuster, a breakout clone.
Was your day, dear?
Tired of doing the same old thing every night? Well, light up those nights with Microvision, Milton Bradley's great new handheld electronic game system. Blockbuster, one of the 7 great game cartridges available, comes with the Microvision unit. Switch cartridges to Connect 4. It's a real mind tease. And for fast action, there's bowling or hitting a jackpot in Vegas slots. So for new excitement, get Microvision, the programmable game system from MB Electronics.
The Microvision did receive some success, but was marred by a number of design problems, including its limited battery life and occasional overheating. It was discontinued 2 years later, and only 12 cartridges were released. Jay Smith would later go on to create the Vectrex. I mean, the Microvision is just a really fascinating curio of history. It's actually interchangeable cartridges. There's a bunch of different types of games, including like Star Trek Phaser, where it was like a Star Trek game. Later it was just called Phaser in Germany, I want to say. But the idea that you would just take the front off of your portable game and then just like stuff a new game in there, and it doesn't look particularly well designed. Like, it looks like you're forcing this cartridge in there, and then every single one of these games has their own controls. I mean, that's really crazy for the time.
Yeah, I almost hesitate to not call them cartridges, because it was like you're replacing half of the machine, basically.
Yeah,
it was almost more like, I don't know, like if you swapped a faceplate on something, but within that faceplate there was also a new game. It was a big process. It wasn't the kind of cartridge that you would think of when you see like a 2600 or something like that.
No, I mean, it's like you said, you're almost gutting your system at that point. I mean, it didn't have a whole lot of sound to it either, but it did produce its own sound, and for the time it was pretty impressive. But like I said, the battery issue, it drained batteries pretty quickly, and it required 2 9-volt batteries. When do you use a 9-volt battery anymore? Even fire detectors and smoke detectors don't use 9-volt batteries, and haven't for like 20 years.
It also wasn't particularly portable, which I guess is a common theme with almost every single handheld console. Like, even today, portable isn't a word I'd use to describe my 3DS XL. It's not going to fit in my pocket very easily.
No, it's like double the size of a wallet.
Yeah, but this thing, the Microvision, it was pretty beefy.
Besides that, all the buttons are obviously just exposed. So you've got this panel knob that you're going to stuff in your pocket, and hopefully that's not going to mess up. But I will say, having that panel was really smart, because that meant games could be played a lot easier. And even though it didn't have many games, From what I've heard, most of them are pretty good. Like, there wasn't like a clunker in the mix. Now, none of them are going to blow you away with their graphics. It's literally black and slight gray, but the gameplay itself was rather fluid. So good on them. And obviously, when he went on to make the Vectrex, he would make the greatest console of all time.
Exactly.
As we all know.
Absolutely.
Taking Star Wars home. For the rest of the 1980s, standalone handheld games would continue to grow, thanks to companies like Tiger Electronics. Innovations such as the solar-powered Bandai LCD Solar Power, the Nelsonic Industry Game Watches, and the head-mounted Tommytronic 3D would evolve the way games were powered and played. But they still functioned as individual games rather than a console. One exception was the Japan-only Epoch Game Pocket Computer. Released in 1984, it featured 4 buttons and a joystick. Despite surpassing some future handhelds in terms of power with a 6 MHz clock speed and a dot matrix screen, it was quickly discontinued after only 5 games were released. For nearly a decade, the portable game market was stagnant. But unbeknownst to the public, there was a new handheld game console. Apex Incorporated, the same company responsible for popular titles like Impossible Mission and Summer Games, had been hard at work with a new handheld, one that would feature color graphics and zooming and distortion of sprites, changeable cartridges, and system links for 18-player multiplayer, and a 3.5-inch backlit LCD screen. The system was finished by 1987, but due to financial limitations, Apex would be unable to release the product. Eventually, they would team with Atari and dub the console the Lynx, with a planned 1989 release.
Hey, Mr. Block, can I go to the bathroom?
2 minutes.
Oh, yes! Oh, yes, yes! Oh, yes, yes! Oh, right!
Introducing Lynx from Atari, the color video game you can get away with. Well, sometimes.
Unbeknownst to Atari, for years, Gunpei Yokoi had created designs for a handheld console, but each were axed for the same reason: price. Witnessing the mistakes of the Game Pocket Computer, Yokoi knew that any handheld would require an affordable price and a long battery life. By the late 1980s, Yokoi saw his opportunity. Utilizing his withering technology strategy, Yokoi created a modest handheld, one that would only feature 4 shades of gray over a 2.6-inch green LCD. However, the Game Boy, as it was later dubbed, would only require 4 AA batteries that could last up to 30 hours. The Z80 CPU would provide fast, albeit occasionally blurry visuals. At one point, the Apex engineers saw the Game Boy at a trade show. Reportedly, they laughed it off and celebrated their impending success. It would never come.
Yeah, the Atari Lynx was a mess.
Yeah.
To say the least. It was, in my opinion, the least portable system that claimed to be portable ever.
Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah.
It's huge. It's super bulky. We're going to be talking about the Game Gear in a little bit. People always think of the Game Gear as kind of a bulky system. It's for, big American hands. The Lynx was massive. You had to strain yourself. It was like 2 original Xbox controllers duct taped together.
It didn't have good battery life. Like, once again, it would only last a short amount of time. It required a lot of batteries. It would only last for about 4 hours. And I will say the visuals were really impressive at the time. But the problem was that they kept having focus groups, and these kids would just say stuff like, "We want a big console, yeah, a big handheld," and they were just trusting these kids to be right. But they weren't. They were children. You shouldn't listen to children who are developing expensive technology. They don't know what they want, and that's why they released like the Lynx 2 like 2 years later. And I remember the Lynx more for being on QVC almost every single night. Like, every night they were trying to sell the Lynx on QVC. They would show you that airplane game, and that's all I really remember about it. Eventually, when I did play some emulated games, they had like a Marlboro cigarette racing game. Like, it was so embarrassing because they developed this before the Game Boy. Like, they were really planning on the future of handheld systems, and it reviewed very well. It got 5 out of 5 stars from multiple publications, but there were too many errors to it.
Yeah, I think it was a little early in the game for a color screen, too. It was blurry, the resolution was not great. The lighting on it was weird. It was tough to see sometimes. And at the end of the day, it's going to come down to, is your software great? Like, I can get over all these problems if you have great software. And most of the games on the Lynx were just Atari arcade ports. And this is in the era when Atari was far past the point of producing the highest quality arcade games.
They had also made some pretty significant errors in the way that they were going to actually figure out how to market the console, and as well as like the distribution process. Like Apex would make all the software, and Atari was going to make all the money off of the hardware. And that's basically the exact same problem that like the 3DO had. You can't afford to sell and make money off of a console because it was like $190 when it came out in America, and that was a huge mistake. Huge mistake. And besides that, it was never going to get anywhere in Japan. Even though Japan wanted handhelds, they weren't going to buy an American console. That's just how they were for a very long time, still are to this day. No interest in it. And the whole screen itself, while it was colorful and really impressive, it was more like edge lighting. It was like the light was coming from like each side of it. There was like a dark center, so if you're playing something like Batman, it kind of looked like crap. And none of the games were like qualified ports of better games. They were always nerfed in some way or another.
This is a handheld console from the makers of the Atari 5200 and the Atari 7800. So, of course, it's the size of a Cadillac in your hands. And, of course, it was mismanaged because, at the time, Atari was not the same company that it was in the late 1970s, early 1980s. This is way past the point of their creative, like, West Coast culture period. This is when, after they had been bought out,
most of their video games were canceled, and then they were brought back quickly, such as, like, the 7800. They had no management anymore. They didn't have the distribution they once had. It was a shell of its former self. It had been bought and sold by so many companies like Warner Brothers and then sold back, and Atari was just in a mess. And it's almost like the Lynx, despite having all this amazing hardware, couldn't keep up because Atari was a tarnished name to begin with. What kid knew anything about Atari by in 1989? They'd moved on to Nintendo. Well, and then there's like the Game Boy on the opposite side, and it doesn't have the colors. It doesn't have the backlit screen. I mean, I remember playing that and just being so annoyed by the glare of like a lamp that I would have to like edge it just right so that I could play the game and see it without the light interfering. But it was just better. Like, it felt faster, and the games were just fun. Like, Super Mario Land was just a good game, whereas I couldn't recognize any of the characters on the Atari Lynx. It was like Castlevania's on the Game Boy, Bionic Commando's on the Game Boy, Mario's on the Game Boy, and all the games were relatively cheap. The handheld was only $90 when it came out, and it launched with Tetris. What more do you need? I mean, the system lasted over a decade and multiple revisions because it was so efficient. Like 30 hours of battery life, that's not an overestimation. You would get somewhere around there all the time. And that's from the first revision in 1989.
Incredibly well built, too. The Game Boy is a tank, an absolute tank. I have my original Game Boy still, the one that I got for Christmas in probably like 1990. I have my original Tetris game that's still in the back of it.
Are you serious?
Yeah, and can put 4 AA batteries in it tomorrow, and it'll fire up and work fine. I had a friend who dropped his Game Boy in the snow during a harsh Michigan winter, and when the snow melted in the spring, we went and got it from the backyard, cleaned it up, dried it off, put new batteries in it, worked like a charm. Game Boys were indestructible. They're still indestructible.
I mean, of course, there's the famous Game Boy from the first Gulf War, which something happened to it. It blew up into a million pieces, or it should have, and now if you go to like the Nintendo headquarters or the Nintendo store in New York, they have it, like this melted Game Boy, and they have it on display that'll still play games.
Mm-hmm.
Not touched. They didn't refurbish it. It just plays games. And that's just shows you the genius of Gunpei Yokoi, his withering technology idea of just saying, okay, what is the most reliable technology that we have right now? What is the cheapest technology that we have right now? That's what we need to use for portables. So while, obviously they go on to make the Super Nintendo and all the whiz-bang graphics and eventually move on to polygons, their handhelds were very consistent of trying to think back to at least 2 generations before. So by the time they're doing the GameCube, they're doing the Game Boy Advance. And that's all thanks to Yokoi. He was one of the smartest people ever involved in technology. Not video games, technology. A brilliant mind.
Nintendo's hardware development philosophy right now is basically it's directly modeled after Gunpei Yokoi's idea of what a handheld console should be, and you see that with not only their handheld consoles, but with the Wii, with the Wii U, and all their new stuff going forward. It's what's reliable, what works, and then the software is going to drive sales, and not the fact that it's the shiniest and the brightest and the newest.
Absolutely, because Yokoi had already been working on Metroid. By that point, he had been developing Metroid 2 for the Game Boy. He understood that games, not hardware, are what sell systems. And unfortunately, the Lynx didn't have games.
They said it wasn't humanly possible. But now you can have all the power and excitement of Nintendo right in the palm of your hand. Introducing Game Boy. It's portable, it's in stereo, and its games are interchangeable. Plus, Game Boy comes with the outrageous new game, Tetris. And for head-to-head competition, use the revolutionary video link and blow your opponent away. Game Boy, only from Nintendo. Now you're playing with power, portable power.
Nintendo released the Game Boy in Japan on April 21st, and America on July 31st of 1989. The price was an affordable $90. Atari would release the Lynx a month later for $179. Nintendo's handheld was an immediate success, while the world's first color handheld struggled to find an audience. They weren't alone in that struggle. The Japanese arcade hitmaker, Sega, had attempted to gain a foothold in the home market with their SG-1000 and Master System, but to little avail. In an effort to capitalize on their popular arcade titles, they released the Mega Drive, or Sega Genesis, in Japan of 1988. But the 400,000 units sold that year were unable to match Nintendo's dominance. Sega of America realized that a traditional ad campaign wouldn't suffice. Sega Entertainment of America's CEO proposed an aggressive ad campaign, declaring the Sega Genesis the more mature system and directly attacking Nintendo.
16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does.
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
does.
Genesis
does.
Genesis
does.
Genesis
does.
Genesis does.
Get Joe Montana free, Pat Riley free, Buster Douglas free, Super Monaco GP free, or Collins free. What Nintendo?
The ads worked, and Sega saw an impressive American launch in 1989, selling 500,000 units. With momentum finally starting to build, Sega knew they needed to compete directly with Nintendo on all fronts, including handhelds.
The Genesis launch was huge because it was the first time we saw video games really starting to grow up a little bit and getting into their sort of snarky teenage years. So the whole Genesis does what Nintendo don't ad campaign was wildly successful, but also because it sort of positioned Sega as the company for these kids who maybe started playing an NES when they were 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, and now they're getting into their tween and teen years, and they want a more mature, edgy console, and that's where the Genesis comes in.
That's really smart, too, because when you look at what kids are into, they're always kind of trying to impress the older children. They always want to be more like the older children. So if Sega says, we're more mature, we got the hits, those are baby toys, well, then the kids are going to be like, well, but I'm not baby. And they're going to want to play the Genesis. I mean, Sega went after a market that was really untapped. You know, Nintendo was reluctant to associate themselves with, like, celebrities for their games. They went the opposite way. They said, here's Buster Douglas boxing. Here's Michael Jackson Moonwalker. Here's John Madden football. And Madden football is what really pushed the Genesis to the forefront and really got a wider, more college-aged group of people to get engaged with the system. But beyond all that, they just said, screw Nintendo. They didn't just simply go out there and say, we are the better system. They said, Nintendo sucks. And it sucked for years. And if you want to play something that's actually interesting and fast, it's us, which, you know, is a lie.
Blast processing, man. Come on.
Blast processing.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do? What if you don't have blast processing?
Oh, God.
Another big thing to consider, too, is when you think about the aesthetic, like just the visual look of like a Sega console. So when you think of Nintendo, the NES was originally marketed as a toy, you know, the Rob the Robot pack-in, and it has kind of a toyish look to it. If you look at the Game Boy, it kind of has, again, that toy aesthetic. It's called the Game Boy, not the Game Man. When you look at a Sega console, they're sleek, they're black, especially once you get into like the Genesis 2.
Yes.
Which is this very aesthetically pleasing, black, sleek, kind of a matte finish. It looks like a high-end consumer electronic product. It doesn't look like a video game toy.
It's true, and Sega really did focus on bringing their arcade hits home, like Altered Beast, which we talked about last week, but they also made sure that they would put marketing on the system itself. Like Genesis it didn't just say Genesis or Mega Drive on it, it said high-definition graphics, 16-bit. Like, they wanted you to know how many bits were in the system, which I don't think anybody knew with the NES how many bits it was, but like, no, that's 8 bits, we have double the bits, which, of course, there were also, like, the TurboGrafx 16 had come out before then, but Sega's marketing and saying, we're the best, and more importantly, Nintendo is garbage, it just turned heads. You didn't see commercials like that, just discrediting and directly attacking their competition almost to a derogatory level. In 1989, Sega began development on Project Mercury. Rather than building a new system, Sega redesigned their fledgling Master System. Although Mercury would feature stereo sound and a far more robust color palette, allowing for 32 colors on the screen at once. Just like the Master System, the Mercury would have 2 input buttons and a joypad, but also a start button. The Master System had seen a following in Europe and Brazil. By creating a handheld on the same architecture, Sega would be able to create games intended for both systems and port them with minimal effort. Unlike the Game Boy, the black handheld would be an 8.23-inch horizontal system for easier grip, and feature a 3.2-inch color backlit screen. But it would come at a cost. 6 AA batteries would be required to power the system, and could be drained in less than 3 hours. To combat this, Sega designed a rechargeable battery. Creating an internal option wouldn't be feasible. So, a large external battery with a similar shape to a rounded remote control and a belt clip was created. Users would also be able to plug their Game Gear into a wall to play uninterrupted. To stand out from the rest of the ever-increasingly populated handheld market, Sega wanted to make the Game Gear a multimedia device. Both an FM radio and TV tuner were created, and the TV tuner would include a jack plug that would allow users to connect their AV cables directly into the system, theoretically allowing the Genesis or any other AV device to be viewed on the Game Gear. In June of 1990, the Sega Game Gear would debut at the Tokyo Toy Show. The Game Gear was considered impressive to the Japanese public, especially due to the disinterest towards the American Lynx. However, the Game Gear would be overshadowed by the first showcase of Sonic the Hedgehog. On October 6, 1990, the Game Gear was released in Japan, selling over 40,000 units in the first 2 days alone, but sales slowed as the weeks went on. Sega would once again turn to the West in hopes of building an audience with their signature attacks against Nintendo.
It swept the country like a plague. Thousands of helpless teenagers trapped in a dull, drab world of colorless video games. But there is hope. Color? Introducing Game Gear from Sega. The full-color portable video game system that separates the men from the boys. Game Gear from Sega.
On April 15th, 1991, Sega would release the Game Gear in Los Angeles and New York City, followed by a national release on April 26th for $150. It would see release in numerous countries in the following months. With promising results, it quickly outpaced the Atari Lynx. I remember the first time I saw a Game Gear, I think it was like at a toy kiosk, and just right away it felt like it was the future. Like it had come from the future. This couldn't really exist. I never saw an Atari Lynx. They just didn't have the marketing. They didn't have the share of the audience. But Sega was so popular with the Genesis that when the Game Gear came out, it was kind of an event. Like it was kind of a big deal. Like you would see columns on there and other games like that, and the full color would just go, whoa, like, it felt so limp afterwards. It was so disappointing to go back and look at your Game Boy. It just looked like mushy crap.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the big selling points for the Game Gear, like the obvious marketing choice. And they did this a lot in the early commercials, where they would literally just have a Game Boy sitting next to a Game Gear, and you could see the two different screens. It looks like smashed peas with, the green LCD screen. And then, you have the bright backlit pop of that Game Gear screen. It also felt big and heavy and expensive in your hands, especially as a little kid. So the Game Gear comes out, and I'm probably like first grade, maybe.
Yeah, same here. Yeah,
somewhere around there. And so just going to like KB Toys or something like that, and going to the kiosk and holding the Game Gear in your hands, it was huge. The Game Boy was made for a child's hands. Okay. It's small, it's compact, it's a little cramped today if you have like normal man hands.
The Game Boy was small by standards then. Today you look at it and it's this huge brick.
Yeah,
but the Game Gear was literally 8 inches long.
It was huge. Yeah, holding it in your hands, it was just massive. And I guess I should clarify when I'm talking about the size of the Game Boy. The Game Boy is big, but it's big because it's tall and it's thick.
Yeah.
Your hands are kind of cramped together on it when you play it.
It's true. It was really hard to kind of like get a grip on it too, because it's just a flat surface. Whereas the Game Gear, like, it was slightly curved, so it felt like your fingers could rest in there. Mm-hmm. It was really comfortable. The two buttons were like really clicky and nice. It felt really good. And comparing it back to the Game Boy, like right away you're like, ugh, no way. Like, this is what I want. Look at these graphics. It's not as smeary and blurry. The games actually look like console games in some cases. I mean, some cases they were like the Master System games. I was blown away. I think a lot of people were. I think that initial buzz just really helped it.
One of the other interesting things that the Game Gear did was the way they marketed it as a full-on AV device, which was still pretty novel at the time. And you saw other companies like Philips and eventually Panasonic with the 3DO, and then, of course, later with Microsoft and the Xbox. We're not selling you a video game console. We're selling you a home entertainment experience that's all-encompassing. And Sega was the first company to really do that with a portable system. You saw things like, the FM radio tuner and the TV tuner. And of course, you needed the battery pack, basically. Because the battery life was horrible. You got like 3 hours of battery life.
See, we had the battery pack, and that thing is... I totally forgot that clip on the end of it was intended to be a belt clip. Mm-hmm. Said you'd be sitting somewhere and you would attach it, and it was huge, too. It was a really big, weird, kind of like bean-shaped device, and it took a really long time to charge. So you'd attach it to your belt, and then you'd be sitting in public with this thing jacked into that. I mean, it was a monstrosity. I mean, we're talking about a portable device, right? I mean, if you wanted to actually go the battery route, though, 6 AA batteries. 6 AA batteries. Think about that for a moment. And then they would only last for at most 5 hours. And there wasn't like, I'll turn down the screen so it won't be so bright. That didn't exist. You just had to deal with the super bright screen.
It was a problem. I don't think I ever got more than 2 or 3 hours out of a Game Gear play session. And if you think about, okay, well, how much do 6 AA batteries cost? I don't know, about $10. So you're basically paying $10 for 3 hours of fun. It's not good. It's not a good balance. So now you need this ridiculous battery pack. You need the screen enlarger thing, which was like a magnifying glass that you put over the screen, so the screen was bigger, and you didn't get as much glare and direct sunlight. So by the time you had that, and maybe you throw a TV tuner on top of it,
or FM tuner,
or an FM tuner,
if you want to just jam out,
Yes, you have like a multimedia experience on the go, but it's not really all that portable, and it's just this giant plastic Frankenstein monstrosity. The TV tuner is cool as shit, and if you can find a Game Gear and it's still working, then you can find a TV tuner. You can't use the TV tuner anymore because of how, TV wave signals work.
Digital signals now, baby.
Yeah, but what you can do is with the use of, some adapters and whatnot, you can plug in any single system that you have into the TV tuner, and you can play it through your Game Gear. So you can take your brand new PS4, and if you have an HDMI adapter, and you adapt it to the TV tuner, you can play it through your Game Gear.
I mean, all the gimmicks that attached to it were just bizarre. I remember, there was the Mega Gear converter, which allowed you to play Master System games on your Game Gear, but I didn't know where you could find any Master System games to begin with. And then there's the magnifier that, every handheld had this, but this ungodly thing that would just attach to it so it would balloon up the screen to maybe double the size, but it really made you realize how bad the graphics were in some ways. I mean, it's outputting light, and then you're magnifying that light. It's never going to look good. Sega had seen the American success of the Game Boy and its pack-in title, Tetris. Sega would respond with a puzzle game of their own, Columns, an arcade and Genesis game that would be ported to the Game Gear as their own pack-in puzzle game for all territories. In it, players would rotate a series of 2 falling jewels, each with their own color. If at least 3 jewels of the same color were connected in any direction, they would explode. A flashing jewel would destroy all jewels with the same color as the one it landed on. Columns received positive reviews and helped display the color of the Game Gear.
Shifted high gear, gear up Game Gear. Full color action right in the palm of your hand. Day or night. Shining black and white. Awesome games. Great Sega names. Game Gear. Game Gear. Full color graphics. Stereo capable. Action that's loud and clear. Gear up. Optional tuner makes it a color TV. Game Gear comes with Columns game. Other games and TV tuners sold separately. Batteries not included. Available at these fine stores. Gear up.
Other launch titles would include the Mega Man-style action platformer Psychic World, a port of Wonder Boy Part 1, retitled Revenge of Drancon, an original version of the Yu Suzuki arcade game G-Lock Air Battle, a third-person version of Super Monaco GP, and a port of Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse with original levels. A system is nothing without games, and while many people will say the Game Gear didn't have too many good games, I disagree. I thought a number of the games were really good. It's just unfortunate that a lot of them came out early, and then the quality just declined. Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse, if you take that game and you put it next to any of the Super Mario lands released on the Game Boy, it's bright, it's colorful, you really get a sense of Mickey when he's running, when he's on the edge of a level, he almost falls off of it, he's trying to regain his balance, you can actually see his facial expression, there's these amazing stages that have giant donuts and ice cream cones, and then it just felt really good. I think it's almost as good as the original Super Mario Land. Maybe not Mario Land 2 and 3, but definitely Super Mario Land for me.
My problem with the software is it hinges almost entirely on Sega arcade ports and ports of either old Master System games or things that were already on the Genesis, but just in kind of a nerfed version. So yeah, you have Streets of Rage, but it's just a neutered version of the one that was on the Genesis. Yes, you have Golden Axe, but it's a neutered version of the one that was on the Genesis. You've got various Sonic the Hedgehog games, and those are of, varying quality.
I think we should talk about it. Sonic 1 on the Game Gear is great. It's fantastic. It really is a thoughtful 8-bit rendition of Sonic. But whenever I read these the best Game Gear games of all time, some reason people list Sonic 2, which is so bad. It is one of the worst games I've ever played. The screen is so zoomed in that you can't see anything that's ahead of Sonic. Random spikes just fall from the ground for no reason. It's like they're timed out to just fall on you right when you pass them. So you can't see ahead of yourself. So of course you're going to get hit by the spikes. And then it's just this crushing difficulty, and it's all within the first stage. You can't get anywhere. It's awful. I tried to replay it a couple years ago. My dumb child brain has grown up into this dumb idiot brain, so obviously it can beat the first stage of Sonic 2. Nope! Still died! But Triple Trouble and, the Chaos game, they were all pretty good.
The interesting thing about the Sonic games on the Game Gear is they weren't developed by Sega or Sonic Team. They were actually farmed out to a third-party company who had kind of a sketchy track record making strange license games. And if you go back and play a lot of the Sonic games that were on the Game Gear, they don't necessarily feel like Sonic games from that era. They have their own kind of style to them, and they actually did a lot of cool stuff that Sonic games didn't do at all for another decade. So in Sonic Triple Trouble, there's these cool transitions between levels. And so there's this one level where you're on a train, and you run to the end, And then instead of the thing where you pass the sign and it, gives you the stats for the level, you just continue on into the next part of the train. And it's really cool. You have these nice transitions. There was different power-ups in those Sonic games. Sonic even had like a snowboard at one point. So Triple Trouble especially really pushed the idea of what a Sonic game could be in the mid-90s. And unfortunately, Sega didn't really pay much attention to those good ideas.
Well, they did give Sonic a snowboard in Sonic Adventure 2. I don't know if I would say that was a good moment, though.
No, probably not that great in 3D.
I thought most of those Sonic games, including like the Tails game that was kind of like an RPG, were really quality. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, they had that advantage of just releasing it on the Master System as well as the Game Gear. And like you said, the Streets of Rage game wasn't as robust. It was a gimped version. You could only have, I think, 2 enemies on the screen at once, in addition to your own player. I think you could have 2-player mode if you plugged in 2 Game Gears. Don't quote me on that.
With a gear link?
With the gear link, that's true. But I mean, it played pretty good. It was pretty fast. I think that's what you can say about a lot of these games, is that they were faster than the Game Boy counterpart, but they were also much, much, much easier, except for Sonic 2, piece of garbage. Like, almost all these games were a breeze to get through in less than an hour, so you still had time to play 2 more games before the thing died for lack of batteries.
If you're interested in playing the Sonic games on the Game Gear, they're actually on the Sonic, one of the Sonic collections that came out on the GameCube, and I think they might be on some of the other Sega collections as well. So they're out there, and they're definitely worth checking out, especially the third-party stuff. Tails Adventure is totally underrated. It's such a good game.
Totally.
It's not what you think it is. So when it comes out, I thought it was going to be sort of, the first time I played it, I thought Tails Adventure was going to be like Yoshi's Story, where it's like, okay, this is sort of like Super Mario World 2, except it's super easy, and it's clearly aimed at children, because Tails was kind of like the kiddie sidekick person.
The little brother player.
The little brother
controller
player.
To the kid, and they just die, and they just come back.
Yeah, so it doesn't matter. It's not like that at all. So again, you have this third-party developer, and they're working with Tails, and they just said, you know what, screw it, we're going to make the game that we want to play. This isn't going to be a Sonic game. So it's basically a Sonic game filtered through an action RPG. So instead of playing like Sonic, it plays more like Demon's Crest.
It's true.
And it's totally crazy.
You level up,
and you
get more abilities.
Yeah, you can toss these different types of bombs, and it's really cool.
It's probably the best out of the bunch, by far, because it does have the action that you're looking for, but with a lot of depth to it. Not incredibly long, but a really fun game.
Another good game, and one of the few solid third-party games that came out, there's a game called Dragon Crystal, I think. I could be screwing up the name. It's on the Virtual Console, so you can play this, and it's actually way better on the Virtual Console. It was an early handheld console roguelike.
Oh, wow.
And I'm going to go out on a limb and say it was probably the first handheld console roguelike that you could purchase. And it's, by definition, roguelike. It is a pain in the ass. The grid movement and the crushing difficulty, and, you pick up vials of liquid and you don't know what they are, and if you drink them, you might die instantly. And the hardest thing about it, you only had a limited number of saves.
Oh my god.
And you're dealing with 3-hour battery life.
See, that's immediately what I thought. Playing a roguelike on the Game Gear sounds like a nightmare, unless you have like the cable to plug in directly to the wall.
Yeah.
Because if that thing dies and you're like, I finally got past that part, it's like, boop.
Yep, and then you're done. But yeah, they're just these cool little games that are sort of overlooked because the Game Gear's catalog was so bland and just sort of saturated with ports and, nothing that really stood out.
One of those ports was a game I played a whole hell of a lot, the original Mortal Kombat on the Game Gear. Let me tell you, that was garbage. It played at maybe 10 frames a second or less.
That might be generous.
That might be. I mean, all the fatalities, it was like, I think he did something to him. That looked really cool. It didn't even have all the characters. Like, I think Sonya Blade was missing, or no, she was in there. Maybe it was Johnny Cage was missing. Either way, people were just straight up missing. There was only like 2 stages, I want to say. The pit, which even if you tried to like knock people into the spikes, it didn't work. And then there was Goro's lair. It was not good. Not good at all. But there were good fighting games. I would say Fatal Fury Special, amazing on the Game Gear. It plays like a very intelligently designed version of Fatal Fury for a handheld, and actually had a great frame rate. Samurai Showdown, once again, awesome on the Game Gear. Like, you can really tell how the Neo Geo Pocket learned a lot from developing games on the Game Gear. And then there's some other good ports. One of my favorites of all time, Micro Machines. Love Micro Machines on the NES, and having the full game on the go was so cool. Being able to drive around on the cereal tracks on the kitchen table, so cool. And of course, Dynamite Headdy, another great port from the Genesis, one of my favorite games from Treasure, I want to say. Gunstar Heroes, another great game by Treasure. It was so cool seeing all these ports, even in Road Rash. Road Rash on the Game Gear was incredible. Now, but the problem is that, like you said, these aren't really original titles. I mean, Tails Adventure is one thing, but all these games have, let's be honest, better versions on consoles.
Exactly. I mean, Gunstar Heroes on the go is cool, but then once you start to realize, okay, well, I can't play multiplayer, and it's missing some of the levels, and that was the problem. Even the games that were great ports, it never felt like I was getting, some amazing experience on the go. And that's not even necessarily bad, but at the same time, these weren't games that were made for the Game Gear. They were just console games, stripped down as much as they needed to be, and then put on the Game Gear. It didn't feel like there was a lot of love or thought put into most of these games.
I mean, there were a few exceptions. There were 3 Shining Force games that were released to the Game Gear that were all excellent. Of course, only one of them was ever officially released in the West in English. It's the Sword of Hajia. I don't know. That might be the way to say it. As well as an excellent Shinobi game that was super fast-paced, and you were bouncing from building to building and quickly attacking, moving from truck to truck. Really cool games. Still not quite original titles, but for the time, it was a lot more motion than you would see on the Game Boy. It really felt like you were playing an authentic video game. Not an original game, but an authentic console-like experience. Whereas the Game Boy was kind of like, here's some games that you're supposed to play for a couple of minutes. I do want to bring up one game that wasn't on the Game Gear, and I could never figure out why it wasn't. Street Fighter II. It came out on the Mega Drive. It came out on the Master System in 1997. That was after they discontinued the Game Gear. But why wasn't there ever a port of Street Fighter on the Game Gear?
I have a theory.
Okay.
Late-ish in the Game Boy's life, so and well past the point of the release of the original Street Fighter II. At least I think. I could be a little bit wrong here on my dates. There was a Game Boy version of Street Fighter II released, and it is atrocious.
Are you talking about Jun Pung 2, the horrible Street Fighter 2 ripoff where they changed all the names and slightly changed the looks, but they all have the exact same moves?
No. It was on the Game Boy, not the Game Gear. Not the Game Gear.
Oh,
the Game
okay.
Boy. So this Street Fighter 2 game came out on the Game Boy.
I remember that.
And it's unplayable. I have a copy of it, and I bought it as a joke. I saw it at like a flea market for like $2 or something. It really is as bad as people say it is. As bad as like Mortal Kombat is on the Game Boy and things like that. Street Fighter 2 on the Game Boy runs at a solid 5 frames per second.
Oh my god.
Not an exaggeration. It's so choppy and unplayable. So my guess is that was probably a colossal failure and an embarrassment for Capcom. And when they finally got around to doing that portable port of the game, the Game Gear was probably kind of, on the downward spiral at that point. So there's really no reason to port it over to the Game Gear. Just, it wouldn't run fast enough. The system wasn't doing the numbers that would justify the creation of the game.
Later in life, though, Sega did continue to support the Game Gear with some pretty awesome versions of even Saturn games. The Panzer Dragoon Mini and Virtua Fighter Mini are 2 really incredible technical achievements. Like, Panzer Dragoon actually runs at a great frame rate. It's got the classic gameplay where you have to highlight areas and then release the button and it fires automatically. And it's pretty obvious why it works. I mean, you have water and you have the sky and things just fly at you and you shoot them. Not the most technically challenging, but very well accomplished. As for Virtua Fighter, well, it had...
It's not 3D.
It's not 3D, but it did feature an amazing commercial where 2 Japanese kids just scream at each other.
Sega.
Yeah, well, and you've also highlighted another interesting part about the Game Gear, which is it's region-free. So the Panzer Dragoon game, it didn't come out in the United States, but if you were an industrious young lad and, you had a local game shop that was cool, you could import it. Or if you're a collector and you want to start collecting for the Game Gear, there's plenty of games that didn't come out in the US that you can easily import. And collecting for the Game Gear is cheap, too, which is a nice bonus.
Most people don't want to bother collecting the console to begin with. We'll get into those reasons why later on. I think we got to address why the Game Gear is still remembered to this day. People might say it's because of its library, they might say because of its technical accomplishments, but really it's because the Game Gear was drilled into our heads with all of these goddamn commercials. And almost every single one of them is incredibly bizarre. Like the weirdest commercials you could see for video game systems at that time. I got a few of these lined up. Let's go through some of these. I found this Australian ad. It's hard to explain, but it's essentially this old man playing a Game Gear and freaking out about it, while this, teenager just acts like an old man talking about the good old days. There's no conclusion. It's just mindless.
Yeah.
I'll tell you some old stories, Vampire. No way, dude! I'm having a most radically bodacious experience with this Sega Game Gear. Remember old Birdie? Wow! Check this atypical color screen, man. Filthy graphics and a free game. Wicked. Oh, those were the days. You could turn it into TV. Wow, excellent with headphones. Party on! Grandpa.
You were talking about one of your favorite Game Gear commercials before we started.
Sure. I remember this vividly from my childhood, and I thought it was kind of weird and funny when I was a kid, and then thinking about it as an adult, all I can really think about is just how completely fucked up it is. But they were really trying to sell the idea that the Game Gear was superior to the Game Boy because of its color screen. So there's this commercial with this fat guy, and he's playing a Game Boy, but he wants it to have a colored screen, and it doesn't. So he hits himself in the head with a squirrel.
It's like rigor mortis squirrel.
Yeah, it's it looks like it's like a taxidermy squirrel, except he's out in the wilderness, so I think you're supposed to assume that it's a real squirrel.
It's like a city park with no trees, and yet there's a squirrel right next to this bench.
It's totally weird. And he hits himself in the head, and there's all these swirling psychedelic colors, and then that's supposed to be his solution. It's just don't hit yourself in the head with a dead squirrel, get a Game Gear.
It's so 90s it hurts.
Yeah.
Hey, there's an easier way to get color. Get a Game Gear, the full color portable with over 150 games, like the new Echo, Mortal 2, and Sonic Triple Trouble.
There, of course, is the commercial where it's almost entirely in black and white, and they say that, if you were as dumb as a dog, it wouldn't matter which system you owned, but then again, you'd also wouldn't mind drinking out of a toilet. If you buy a Game Boy, you probably drink out of toilets. They're suggesting this. But here's the funny thing. The dog in the commercial, his name is Chunty, and he's actually the Sega of America CEO's dog.
Old Chunty.
Old Chunty.
If you were colorblind and had an IQ less than 12, then you wouldn't care which portable you had. Of course, you wouldn't care if you drank from the toilet either. Game Gear.
Sega really was going after Nintendo. So if it was going to be a Genesis ad, Super Nintendo sucks, when the Super Nintendo came out. And then when it came to the Game Gear, it was the Game Boy sucks. There's this whole commercial where they say, hey, whatever you do, don't just throw away your Game Boy. There's so many uses. You can pet the cat with it. You can put it underneath wobbly chairs. It's so insulting.
We at Sega have learned that some people are actually throwing their one-color portables away. We urge you to stop. There are still many practical uses for them. Fix a wobbly chair. Look, a cat massager. Spread cheese snacks. We at Sega admit we may have an unfair advantage. With Game Gear being a full-color portable with tons of new games, this is still no excuse. Use them to tenderize meat, as sunblock, or whisk away unsightly poop. Please help save the planet.
I think my favorite thing about the Game Gear's ad campaign is how long it went on. Like, people don't realize the lifespan of this system is insane. No one would have ever guessed that they literally went toe-to-toe with the Game Boy for almost the entire duration of the Game Boy's life. And the fact that Sega is doing this, of all companies, the company who puts out a system and 5 minutes later puts out a new system and trashes the old one, but they continue to fight against the Game Boy forever, even as they were, getting completely smashed. They just kept trying.
And I don't think it helped that because of how aggressive they were about how bad the Game Boy was, they weren't insulting the games, they were insulting the hardware. And then eventually that wasn't good enough, so they were insulting the people. There's this one commercial where it's just these ugly, ugly people watching a bug zapper and bugs dying and saying that's what the Game Boy is. And if you play Game Boy, this is you, and you probably eat disgusting foods.
Some people are content to be entertained by simple one-color electronics. Somehow these people have just never heard of Game Gear, the multicolor portable from Sega with tons of new titles. Yeah, some people are like that, but then some people like to eat pickled pork lips.
Then there's just weird ads like this cow trying to sell Sonic Triple Trouble.
I'm a cow, and I know trouble when I see it. This is Sonic Triple Trouble, new for Game Gear, featuring the evil Dr. Robotnik, Knuckles, and Knack. But that trouble ain't nothing compared to this.
Here's probably the ad that bothered me the most. There's this commercial with this middle-aged guy who has this insane extension cord that is plugged into his television, and it's going all the way up into an airplane that's flying in the sky, and he's got his Genesis and TV there, and he's just playing his Genesis, and then eventually gets unplugged, and it's like, what are you doing, dude? Get a Game Gear so you can play all your games. Now, it doesn't say anything bad about Nintendo, but it's such a lie. It's like, you don't need to be plugged in with the Game Gear, which is such a lie. You had to constantly be plugged in with the Game Gear or have batteries upon batteries. Like, literally, you would have to carry at least an extra 6 batteries on you if you plan to have a day with the Game Gear.
If you were taking a flight from Chicago to LA, you would need a fresh set of batteries in the Game Gear and probably another 6-pack ready to go if you want to play the entire time.
It's insane that they would even say, like, oh my goodness, this is an on-the-go system. It's not. You can't get anywhere with the Game Gear.
Hey man, get portable. Get a Game Gear Supersonic Sports Pack. A colored portable Game Gear, carrying case, and 2-hit games. Sonic 2, and the Major Pro Baseball. Whoa, you can save $50. The Game Gear Supersonic Sports Pack. You know who makes it.
Coffee? Tea?
By the end of the Game Gear, the Game Boy had actually started to have different colored shells, and they had like new models. And Sega took it to its natural conclusion and said that that's all gimmicks. By the end of this, Game Boys are going to be wearing furry little dresses.
Attention consumers. Certain portable gaming systems are being dressed up in order to distract the buyer from their ordinary one-color play. What could be next? Little flower print dresses? Black leather restraining devices? Fresh baked olive loaf? Don't be fooled. Get Sega Game Gear. Basic black on the outside. Hundreds of exciting full-color games radiating from the inside. And we promise no sleazy little get-ups that scream, hello, big boy. Get Game Gear. Sega!
Now you juxtapose that with the Japanese ad campaign, and it's just like, everybody have fun. Life is good.
もう高橋はハンディゲーム機はカラーじゃないと楽しくないと宣言します。
パズルゲームぷよぷよもぷよっと大人気
というわけでいつでもどこでもカラーが楽しいゲームギア。
And then over in America, where it saw more success, it was mean, which almost kind of says, as bad as these ad campaigns were, they worked. They absolutely worked.
Mm-hmm. They're some of the most quintessentially 90s ads, I think, that you could find.
Totally.
If you want to know what tech marketing was like in the 90s, Game Gear ads are a great place to start.
I think if you want to know what 90s commercials were like, just like watch some silent films and then watch footage of like a 12-year-old screaming and then like a woman wearing like glasses and a furry dress that's like writing on a chalkboard. I feel like that was 95% of the 90s. It's insane. It's absolutely insane. The original Black Shell Game Gear wasn't the only Game Gear though. A number of variations including yellow, white, light blue, and blue were created, but none is more sought after as the Coca-Cola Game Gear. Released only in Japan in 1994, the console featured a red shell with a Coca-Cola logo and a pack-in action platformer called Coca-Cola Kid. Other variations include a camouflage Virtua Fighter Mini Edition and a dark red Magic Knight Ray Earth Edition. Sega attempted cross-media by marketing the Game Gear to Cocoa Pebbles fans.
Sega has joined forces with Cocoa Pebbles. Cool! Now you can find a rebate offer good for $5 back on any of these Sega Game Gear games. On Cocoa Pebbles or these other Post cereals.
I did not know that.
It's pretty weird.
Well, I'm glad that they've, they're trying to lure in the lucrative soda drinker and sugar cereal eating markets.
Barney, don't turn on my Game Gear. Oh, it's already dead. All right, do whatever you want with it. Unfortunately, Sega's handheld only found moderate success in the market. Despite companies such as Electronic Arts, Virgin Interactive, and Namco developing titles for the system, the majority of games were published, developed, and funded by Sega. At one point, Sega and Blockbuster announced a project that would allow Blockbusters around the country to duplicate Game Gear games and rent them out. Third parties showed disinterest, and the project was quickly scrapped. By 1997, Sega discontinued the Game Gear, only a year after Atari ended the internal development for the Lynx. By this point, the Japanese company had lost millions in their once profitable console division. Despite a healthy 11 million units sold and 390 games released, the Game Gear was in a far, far distant second to the seemingly evergreen Game Boy. The last official release was The Lost World Jurassic Park in 1997. It's weird too, because when the Game Gear ended, I don't feel like it was a big deal. I didn't even notice when it happened. It just sort of faded away. I'm not sure even when the commercials stopped.
Well, I think the biggest takeaway from this was the Atari Lynx was developed for until 1996, which is just like, holy shit.
By Atari.
Yeah, by Atari, yeah.
And people would continuously develop for it even after that.
Which is insane. But yeah, when the Game Gear went away in 1997, again, I probably would have been in, sixth grade maybe at this point? Somewhere around there. So, I mean, the Game Gear, it seemed to be everywhere when I was in elementary school. But yeah, by the time I got to middle school, it was just like, what's a Game Gear? No one had one, no one cared. But it's still a pretty decent run, and it wasn't exactly the end of the run for the Game Gear either.
No. However, in 2001, Majesco announced the Game Gear's return. February 21st, 2001, Edison, New Jersey. Further strengthening its position to the handheld arena, Majesco Incorporated today announced it has acquired rights from Sega Toys to remanufacture the classic Sega Game Gear portable gaming console. The system will be available at Toys R Us stores and online, www.toysrus.com, and will be value priced at $29.99. Majesco additionally announced plans to support the system by publishing original Game Gear games, also value priced at $14.97. Majesco will manufacture and publish 10 games for the Game Gear system. These titles include Disney's The Lion King, Aladdin, The Jungle Book, Deep Duck Trouble, Caesar's Palace, Super Battle Tank, Sonic Chaos, Sonic Spinball, Pac-Man, and Miss Pac-Man. This newer version included a brighter, though easier to scratch screen. It was once again discontinued shortly thereafter. It's so bizarre to me that they would even try to revive the Game Gear when it didn't fix any of the problems. The screen's brighter, but the battery life still sucks. And they say they're going to release these new games, which they never did. They announced Frogger, and then they never did it. Majesco was in a weird spot then.
Yeah, they had some strange deal with Sega, because if I'm not mistaken, they also were responsible for the release of the Genesis 3, is that correct?
I believe so.
Okay, which was a tiny version of the Sega Genesis that, I don't know, it wasn't really better in any way. There's actually a lot of games that you couldn't play on a Genesis 3, and I guess the sound chip was a little bit different too, so the sound wasn't quite as good. So I don't know why Majesco was doing this. There wasn't really a nostalgia market for it yet. So this would be the equivalent of a third-party company suddenly deciding that they wanted to release the Nintendo Wii again or something.
Yeah.
Like, why would you do that?
Well, the Wii was at least successful. The
Yeah.
Game Gear only had 11 million sold.
Yeah, so I guess maybe that's a bad comparison. I don't even know what the comparison would be.
I re-released the Lynx.
Yeah, re-released the... I mean, there's not really a good example of a modern failed console that would fit the bill. It didn't make any sense. And I remember them being on store shelves when I was in high school, and it didn't really register with me that like a different company was re-releasing these things. It was just like, there's a Game Gear. Must have been sitting there for the past 5 years on that toy shelf. Like, what?
Especially at $30, though. That's a pretty good price for a Game Gear. Mm-hmm. I mean, you could immediately start collecting all the old games that are at discount prices. But why on earth would you go out and spend $15 on games you could pick up for like $1? Like literally $1.
Yeah.
Hundreds of titles, even the best of the best, because no one collected the Game Gear.
Mm-hmm. Well, and even $30 for the system, you could say, well, that's a great deal. But on the other hand, I mean, you're going to be paying that much in batteries in the first week.
Seriously.
So, without addressing the battery issue, you're running into problems.
And
on
I don't
top
think
of that,
they didn't release the accessories either.
Yeah, none of the accessories, or I shouldn't say none of the accessories, a good number of the accessories for the original Game Gear didn't function with the re-release. So if you wanted the, the Master Gear or whatever it was called that allowed you to play Master System games, well, too bad, that doesn't work. I think some of the battery packs, probably some of the third-party ones didn't work. So you ran into a host of problems.
Can't use the TV tuner, which is one of the most
God.
popular features. Why would you even own a Game Gear without a TV tuner?
If you're not tuned into some TV, I don't know.
I mean, a very strange ending for the Game Gear.
Mm-hmm. And you could say this sort of foreshadows the idea of clone consoles, Shortly thereafter, once the NES patents kind of, started to go away, you saw people starting to make clone NESs, now we have clone Super Nintendos, etc., etc. But the difference is clone consoles feed off of nostalgia.
And improvements to that technology.
Yeah, and ease of use, and there's a whole host of different things that clone consoles offer people who just want to reconnect with something from their childhood. Chances are, if it's 2001, you're not going to buy a Game Gear because there's no nostalgia there. Why would there be?
I mean, they're essentially competing with the Game Boy Advance, which has better graphics, even though it wasn't backlit when it came out around then. And it's, it's obviously a little bit more expensive, but the battery life is way longer than the Game Gear. Mm-hmm. Way longer.
Yeah, it's almost pathetic in a way, because at this point, the Game Boy Advance is out, the graphics are better, the system is better in every conceivable way, and it's like the Game Gear is the old sleazy guy who rolls up to the high school because it's his old stomping ground. He's like, hey girls, I used to be the king around here. And it's like, oh, Game Gear, go home.
Speaking of the decline of the Game Gear, the systems didn't age very well either, with a lot of hardware errors.
Yeah,
put it lightly.
The collector market for the Game Gear is really fucked up. If you want an original Game Gear, my advice to you is don't get an original Game Gear. Unless you have the opportunity to actually test it. I wouldn't buy one on eBay. I wouldn't buy one from a flea market without 6 AA's in your back pocket ready to check it out. The reason is during the late 1980s, I guess a lot of electronics companies were producing shit capacitors. So yeah, on the Game Gear and the Turbo Express, the capacitors would go. And what this would do is it would affect the screen and it would affect the sound. So most Game Gears at this point, those capacitors have blown. They're fried. And what that does is it either distorts the screen so you get like little, squiggly lines instead of a clear picture, or the most common thing is the sound is gone completely. So if you buy a Turbo Express now, or if you buy a Game Gear now, I would say 8 out of 10 times, you're not going to have sound.
That really also allowed a whole environment of modders to come in. I mean, we talked to these guys last year, Portables of Doom. They would actually go in, they would swap out the backlight, but they would still retain the original design of the Game Gear. They would just enhance it, rechargeable batteries, things like that. There is a very passionate group that loves the Game Gear, they're very small because, let's face it, if only 11 million people bought this thing like 17 years ago, then there's not going to be many people left to really carry the flag for the Game Gear. Mm-hmm. But I will say that if you do plan on buying one, get one of these refurbished ones. There's so many people out there that are fixing up Game Gears, and the games are dirt cheap. But like you said, don't just buy a used one. The screen might not work at all.
Yeah, if you can get a Game Gear that's still in working order, okay, so let's say you happen to find one, it's actually a pretty fun system to collect for because, like you said, the games are dirt cheap. They're easy to find. If you go to a flea market, there's always tons of Game Gear games, and they're rarely priced for over $1 because people aren't buying them. Nobody collects for the Game Gear.
No, it's a shame, too, because I miss them. Sega lived on in other handhelds, including their follow-up system, the Sega Nomad, a portable Sega Genesis handheld that featured many of the same issues as the Game Gear. Sega also helped usher in the iPhone when Super Monkey Ball was handpicked by Steve Jobs to help introduce the App Store. Eventually, Sega developed games on other handhelds such as the Wonder Swan and even Nintendo handhelds like the Game Boy Advance and DS. In March of 2012, Sega began publishing Game Gear games on the 3DS Virtual Console. To this day, the Game Gear remains one of the most successful non-Nintendo handhelds.
Yeah, you know, we've spent some time kind of shitting on the Game Gear a little bit.
Deservedly so.
Deservedly so.
If you were there, we ain't got no rose-tinted glasses here. We were there. We played it. It was awesome for 3 hours, and then just garbage until you could get more batteries.
Mm-hmm. It is worth noting, though, that you're right. It is the most successful non-Nintendo handheld.
Until Sony's blah, 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 PSP and all that.
Yeah.
But that would take, like 15 years after the release of the Game Gear.
If you look at it like that, like the fact that when Nintendo was at the very, very top of their game, more so than any other time in the company's history, when they were complete golden gods, the fact that Sega was able to compete at any level at all with the Game Boy is impressive in and of itself. My biggest takeaways from spending time with the Game Gear and going back and revisiting it later, when you play the Game Boy, you can tell that the games that were designed for the Game Boy and the way that the Game Boy was designed as a system, it was designed for portability. And that's one thing that other manufacturers of handheld consoles never understood. So when you look at the Turbo Express, when you look at the Lynx, when you look at the Game Gear, when you look at the Nomad, they all share a few common things. They're expensive, the battery life is shit, and they're all trying to take a home experience or an arcade experience and shove it into a handheld device. Nintendo was smart enough to realize that a portable experience is completely different from an arcade or a home experience, and that's why they succeeded. Game Gear's biggest problem was they never really figured that out. And the other thing that you can take away from the Game Gear is software is king. And no matter what, Columns is okay, Clax is fine, and who the fuck knows what the Turbo Express had, but none of those games are Tetris. And Tetris is the perfect portable game. It is the template for playing video games on the bus. That's basically still the gold standard for today.
It just really hurts to look at the Game Gear sales at 11 million and then look over at Nintendo, which would sell over 120 million, over 10 times what they sold. But you're right. The Game Gear had a few problems going against it beyond the hardware designs. Blockbuster and them, if they would have worked together and you could have rented Game Gear games, they could have bolstered the market significantly, but you just didn't rent portable games at most places, so it was hard to get the market out there, whereas rentals of systems such as the Sega Genesis really helped Sega do better. But unfortunately, it was hard to get the word out there, and what they really did at the end of the day is they promoted people to recognize the name Game Boy by insulting them in nearly every commercial. They constantly reminded you that the Game Boy existed, that it was out there. That's not good to educate a consumer when you're trying to market against them.
But at least with their marketing, and this is another thing that I think Sega did pretty well with the Game Gear. One thing the Game Gear was that the Game Boy never was the Game Gear was cool. And that's not something that you can necessarily manufacture or that you can buy. And, they marketed it the right way. But at the end of the day, when you held it in your hand, you looked at it, and you compared it to a Game Boy, Even if it was shitty, even if the battery life sucked, even if the games weren't as good, at least it was fucking cool.
When people looked at you, they thought, wow, you've got a Game Gear. And only if you owned one did you know of all the caveats to that coolness. But at that time, yeah, if you saw somebody playing a Game Gear, or even later on a Nomad, it blew your mind. You had no idea how bad it could actually get. But I'll always remember the Game Gear fondly, because I did love the games on there. From Streets of Rage, to Sonic the Hedgehog, to Dynamite Headdy, Game Gear had a bunch of great games. Maybe not portable games, but great games nonetheless. Steve, I think that's going to do it for the Game Gear. This episode, believe it or not, is not nearly as long as the battery life of the Game Gear. We did it! The Game Gear outlasted us, and that's kind of nice. So, Steve, where can people reach you on the internet?
You can reach me on Twitter at Steve Cuff, or you can reach me on OptimismVaccine.com, or you can go to YouTube and type in Optimism Vaccine and see all the fun videos that I make.
Sometimes. I highly recommend you go do that. You can also follow me on Twitter, Dr. Karate Chop. That's at Dr. Karate Chop. You can also go to the YouTube, which is still labeled Games Under Pressure. Well, I think that's going to do it. Thanks for hanging out today, Steve, and taking this trip down memory lane.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Just remember, guys, the Game Gear is forever.